Good morning. We're going to continue our Christmas series where we're looking at various ways the Old Testament points to the New Testament and to the Christmas story itself. And so today I'm going to look at the Magi. Last week we saw the shepherds and how they came and worshiped and then left and told people about what they had found. And today we're going to look at the Magi and see how they came to worship and what we can learn from them. The Magi, and this whole story, this section here with the star and the Magi, there's a lot of mystery here. There's a lot of misunderstandings, like just misconceptions about what actually happened. And sort of we read over some facts that are helpful to us in understanding it better. And so today we are going to take and kind of look at what are the facts and what do we learn from them? What do they tell us that maybe we've overlooked? And so we can gain some clarity and understanding in this little section of the Christmas story, and also hopefully so that we can worship God more effectively as well. And so we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12 this morning. If you have your Bibles, I'd love for you to turn there. If you don't have a Bible, there's some around you, like in front of you, under the seats, those sort of things. Tap your neighbor, tell them to pass one down, whatever you might need. If you got your phone, it's on there probably too, right? All right, Matthew chapter 2, verse 1 says, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, in the time of King Herod, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem." I want to stop real quick so we can understand a couple things just in this first sentence. And the first is King Herod. Herod was also known as Herod the Great. He ruled over the area of Judea from 37 BC until AD 4. And knowing his reign and his life is a key fact we need to know to time when, in fact, Jesus was exactly born. And so that is when he reigned. He was Jewish in heritage, meaning he was raised Jewish, but he actually worked for the Roman government as the overseer of this area of Judea. And that was thanks to his father's political maneuvering to get him into that position. And he was a man who was known for his great ambition and his huge kind of extensive building projects of different things he got built in that area during his reign. And he was also known for his cruelty. And that's going to be important next week, okay? So put that in your pocket, and we'll talk more about it next week. But he was known for being a cruel man. And that stemmed from another thing we need to know about him that plays into this whole story and the whole interactions that's happening here. And that is that Herod had trust issues, okay? He was a very insecure guy. He had this belief that everybody was out to get him, that everybody was out to take his throne, to take his position. And so he was suspicious of everybody around him, and that included even his own family. He killed a number of his family members, including his wife, because simply he suspected that they were coming after him and they wanted him dead. And so his insecurity and his cruelty would be paired together in how he would kind of protect himself and protect his throne. And again, that's going to play out in our story here, so keep that in mind. The second thing is we see it says here that wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. And this is where there's a lot of misunderstanding, is who exactly were these wise men? We hear them in different tellings of the story. Are they wise men? Are they magi? Are they three kings? Who are these guys? Who exactly are they? What was their profession? What did they do? And why was it that they came this particular time? Actually, in the text, the Greek term here is magi, and it comes from a Parisian word, which was used to describe people who were experts regarding the stars, so astrologists. And so we know that there was certainly this of what all the different things the Magi were. It's centered around their study and understanding of the stars and of the skies and everything that has to do with astrology. They knew historically they came from this priestly line from the Babylonian Empire, the Chaldean Empire, and so it goes back quite a ways in terms of their history leading up to this point. In fact, if you were with us this summer and we went through the book of Daniel, And you remember Daniel was one of these really wise guys that could interpret different things for the king. You remember that? And you remember he was part of this group of people that the kings would set up to do these exact things, to interpret dreams and to help the kings better understand what was happening around them. That was their belief, right? Well, Magi come from this line of thinking and from this kind of historic line of understanding of what their jobs were, so to speak, what their specialty was. And in fact, there is a theory among some scholars that these Magi could have been from the line of Magi traced back to Daniel himself, because as we see in the story, they had a very keen understanding of the Old Testament and of the prophecies of the Old Testament to know what was happening, to look at the sky and to see what was happening and to say, oh, we got to go because the Savior's been born. And so there's this conjecture by some scholars that maybe Daniel had this Jewish-centric Magi school, if you will, line of thinking that then over 600 years had gotten passed to these guys right here. Now, who knows if that's true, but that is what some scholars believe, because there was about 600 years in between here, and so we're not sure. Another theory is comes out of the Psalm 72. Got dyslexic for a minute. Psalm 72. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. It says this, that the kings of Tarshish and the coastlands will offer gifts, and the kings of Sheba and Seba will bring tribute. And there's this psalm that's projecting out into the future, prophesying what will happen when the Messiah is born. And so there are some that believe these were kings who came, kings from different regions, Tarshish and Sheba and Seba, to pay worship. And that the Magi perhaps maybe isn't the correct word, that maybe it's kings. There are others still that say, no, because it's Magi, and because we know of the relationship from Daniel and other places between Magi and their kings, of how they served them, that perhaps these were Magi, but the kings from these places sent them as representatives. And so they came as ambassadors. So even though it was Magi here worshiping, it was on behalf of the kings worshiping. And so therefore, Psalm 72 works. Does that make sense? There's kind of some different theories that scholars have that we're not sure, because honestly, there's not a lot of info about these particular Magi. There's not a lot here in the story. We know things about Magi, but not these particular Magi. And so here's what we can be certain of in all of this as we kind of wade through what exactly was happening. This is what we can be certain of. And I think this is going to the point of what Matthew was trying to communicate to us here in this section. And that is this, that these were Gentile Magi, non-Jewish Magi, who traveled well over 900 miles from Babylon to Jerusalem with the full belief that this child was the Messiah and that they had come to worship him. So Gentiles traveled long distance, made great sacrifice to worship the Messiah. Okay, so even though we don't have a lot of details around the Magi, we get this central point. And so let's keep reading and see what happens as they get to Jerusalem. They get there saying, "Where is the one who was born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Okay, so there's more things here that we're not clear about, right? And there's a lot of questions about in our culture of what was the star? What exactly was it they were following? What we see here is that they came and they're asking questions, that they knew a lot. They knew a lot about what was happening. They'd seen the star. They knew it was supposed to indicate. They came, but they didn't know where. And so we don't know who exactly they're talking to, but our guess is they were talking to somebody they believed would know the answer. So as we're going to see here in a moment, they have an interaction with Herod. Maybe they went straight to Herod. We don't know. Maybe they went to some religious leaders or to some Jewish governmental leaders or something. But they've gone to somebody whom they believed would know the answer. They would know the answer to, where is this child? Where is this king? And I want you to notice that. Their question is interesting, because their question isn't, hey, where is the one born who will become the king? That isn't their question. Their question is, where is the one who is born king. Like today is king. That this baby, in their mind, is the king today. Where's the king? So I want you to imagine for a moment, you're one of the Jewish leaders, and you hear this question. This is a threatening question, isn't it? I want you to imagine for a moment you're Herod, because here in a moment, we're going to read that Herod gets wind of this. And you're insecure, cruel Herod. Now what's going through your mind? That there's this belief that someone has been born who is today the king, not you. It's going to cause problems. This is the tension of the story that's building. And then let's talk about the star. Because they said right here that his star, when it rose, that's how they knew. That there was something about this star that when it rose, they knew the Messiah has been born, we need to go. So what exactly was this star? Well, we go back to Numbers 24, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. It says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not close at hand. Remember, this is 1,000 more years in the past, pointing forward. It says, a star will march forth out of Jacob, and a scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the skulls of Moab and the heads of all the sons of Sheth. So there was this prediction, this prophecy pointing forward that a star would march forth, would rise out of Jacob. And in the ancient culture, the idea of stars and scepters was synonymous with kings. So they knew, based on what they understood of all this, that this meant the birth of the king. But it still begs the question, what exactly was the star? Was it a normal star that they just knew something different about? Was it something more noteworthy like a supernova or a shooting star or a comet or something like this? What exactly was it? And the honest answer is we're not sure, but there are enough clues here in the text. If you really take Matthew and then a little bit of Luke and you piece them together, you get you can kind of narrow some things down. Because what we're going to see is this star actually acted like most stars do, but yet didn't act like some stars do. There are things about the star that are unusual, or at least about how people didn't or did notice the star, but the star actually does what stars do. There's a phrase here when it says it rose, or it came out of the east in the text, is this word Anatole. Which means to rise, that the star rose. And so it's this normal star behavior that they saw, a star rising up. And as we keep going through the text here in a few minutes, we're going to see that over a long period of time, the star was still there. That's interesting. Most would say that as you kind of narrow down and take options away based on different things, that either the star was a constellation, and that constellation did something really unique and really specific that the constellation would not normally do, or it was something supernatural that we have no kind of natural explanation for, one of the two. Because most of the other explanations, like a shooting star, just don't make sense. Shooting stars go whoosh, and they're gone. Whereas we're going to see this for months being present. That's not what shooting stars do. So there's certain things that just we can take off the table, even though we don't quite for certain know maybe what it was. And so they somehow knew what they were seeing with their expertise in the skies and in astrology. They knew what they were seeing. They knew it was unusual. They knew it was unique, and they paired it with their understanding of the Old Testament scriptures and said, there has been a Messiah, a king born in Jerusalem, and we need to go. And so they did. And it says right there that their purpose was to go to worship him. That's the very end of verse 2. That their purpose was to worship. They didn't come for any other reason than to worship. They didn't come because, hey, a king has been born and we need to go schmooze him over and get on his good side. They weren't doing any of that. They said, the Messiah has been born. We must come and worship. So I want you to picture this. Pull out your Middle Eastern map in your head as best you got it. And they were in Babylon, which is Iraq, Iran area. The star is over Jerusalem and as their way of seeing it. And so think of Israel. And now you can't draw a straight line between those two because you'll die in a desert. You have to go around the desert to get there. So they would have walked or ridden camels or walked with camels, however, over 900 miles to get to Jesus. Now, I don't know how fast you can walk, but that would take me a bit, right? That would take a while. That's weeks, if not months of travel time. And you can just do the math. If you do 10 miles a day, that's 90 days at least, right? And then think about the sacrifice. I mean, these were guys that had lives just like us, different lives, obviously, as Magi, but they had lives. They had to leave everything. They had to pack up the supplies and the things they would need to take a many-month journey. The logistics required of time and resources, energy and food and water and planning and mapping it out. They wouldn't have just seen the star and jumped on their camels and gone. This would have taken some planning and then taken some time to go. And they were making significant sacrifices to make it happen. I think the first thing we learn about worship is that it requires sacrifice. That there is something of us that will need to be sacrificed to worship Him well. Many of us, we struggle to make coming on Sundays a priority. We're just so busy, right? Or we struggle to make a morning quiet time happen because I'm just so busy. And these guys took months. You figure if it's 90 days one way, it's 90 days back, right? These guys set aside 6 months of their time, or more, I would guess more actually, to come and to worship. So I think it'd be wise of us to evaluate our worship, to ask, what is it costing me? What am I willing to give up? What am I willing to pay, so to speak, to come and worship? Today, on any given day, any given morning, any given evening, what is it costing me to come and worship? And so they arrive, they start asking questions, and in verse 3, it says, when Herod heard this, meaning this question they had, he was alarmed, and all of Jerusalem with him. Now again, we don't know exactly who they were asking these questions to, but word spread. And we remember who Herod is, right? We remember his insecurity. What I find interesting here, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but of the people they're talking to, nobody knows what they're talking about. Nobody was like, oh yeah, that baby born down in Bethlehem. Nobody's like, oh yeah, I saw that star too. I've been wondering what. Nobody said that. They were asking questions and people were like, I don't know what you're talking about. And even he's alarmed. It's like, this is the first time he's heard anything about this. He's like, what do you mean? A king who's not me. What are you talking about? There's this interesting part there that nobody seems to have noticed. The star or heard of Jesus. But they come and they're asking questions. And Herod, in his insecurity and trust issues, gets alarmed. And everyone around, all the Jewish folk in the community, they're asking questions too. They're like, wait a second, Messiah? The Messiah, like that Messiah? Is that the one you'd think? There's this kind of anxiety being raised about what are you actually talking about? What are these questions? What do you mean? So, some scholars believe the people of Jerusalem were getting anxious, were getting alarmed because they knew Herod's reputation. And they were fearful that if this is true, what's Herod going to do? And if you know the rest of the story, which we'll get to next week, that was a legitimate fear. And so they're asking around. In verse 4, it says, after assembling all the chief priests and experts in the law, that's the scribes, he, meaning Herod, asked them where the Christ was to be born. So a Jewish guy asking the Jewish leaders, hey, where was this Messiah supposed to be born? Tell me the Old Testament. Tell me their Hebrew Bible. Tell me where it is that he's to be born. They said, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it's written this way by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are in no way least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people. That's Micah chapter 5, verse 2, which we've talked about every single week so far this series. So it's interesting. Nobody knew, but he goes to the experts. He goes to the people who he thinks will know the answer. And he says, so where was this child supposed to be born? You notice he doesn't come and ask, did you know he had been born? He didn't ask, hey, have you gone and worshiped? Have you heard this news? In his insecurity, he says, so where? So where? He wants to know specifically, geographically, where is this supposed to happen? And getting inside his mind a little, we think we know why, don't we? And then, under the pretext in verse 7, he says, Herod privately summoned the wise men and determined from them when the star had appeared. Again, he doesn't know. He hasn't seen the star. He sent them to Bethlehem and said to them, go, look carefully for the child, and when you find him, inform me so that I can go and worship him as well. And if this was a movie, you'd have like this darkness, this suspicion, right? Because we know him. He had no interest in worshiping. His interest was in protecting his throne. So, he doesn't know. He's clueless. He's saying, I don't know what you're talking about, but you guys seem to know what you're talking about, so go on my behalf. Figure it out and come back and tell me. And let me lie to you and tell you that I want to go worship too. And so, they go. After listening to the king, they left. And once again, the star, they saw it when it rose, led them until it stopped above the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they shouted joyfully. As they came into the house and saw the child with Mary, his mother, they bowed and they worshiped him. They opened their treasure boxes and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So the star's still there. Months later, right? From when they first seen it, we're 3-4 months down the road. It's still there. It's still Anatole. It still rose again in some specific way that they understood what it was and were connecting these dots. And there's something important here, and your and I's translations may or may not help us in this, but in verse 11, it says, they came into the house and saw the child. It doesn't say baby, and they're actually, in the Greek, two different words. It's no longer an infant. These pictures we have of Jesus being born and the shepherds coming, and about the time they go, here come knocking on the door the Magi. And we have this nice nativity scene where they're all gathered around. That isn't how it happened. The Magi were months later. The shepherds came that night because the way the angel came to them and they went right into town. But the Magi, because it was a star, because of the journey it would have taken to go 900 plus miles, it was months later. And the term here is specific to child, which infers toddler age. We know he more than 40 days old because at 40 days, Joseph and Mary would have gone and given an offering at the temple, and that's recorded for us, I believe, in Luke, if I remember right. And the offering they make is one of absolute poverty. Whereas if they would have had the gifts, they would have offered one of the gifts as the offering. But we also know, here in our part next week, we're going to foreshadow a bit, that Herod deems everybody under the age of 2 to be killed. And so we know we have this window from age 2 to 40 days. Somewhere in that time span is when the Magi would have arrived. To a child, not a toddler. Or a child, not a baby. And so, they came. Seeing the star, still following the star, and you notice their response when they saw the star rise again. It was absolute joy. Absolute joy. They were excited. The text, the wording of the text is that they rejoiced with a very great joy that the star was still there, and it led them. And it says, then they bowed down and worshiped him. And the actual, most literal reading here is that they threw themselves to the ground when they saw him. So picture you doing that. When was the last time you threw yourself to the ground in awe and humility and worship of God? What's your posture for worship? Whether sitting here, whether at home, having your quiet time when you meet with God, what's your posture? Is it one of ho-hum? Is it one of casual? Is it one of, I'm barely awake and checking the box with God this morning? What's your posture? Is it one where there's this belief that God and I aren't that much different? Yeah, he's God, so he's a little, he's higher than me, but we aren't that much different, right? Or is it this posture of awe? This posture of just absolute gratitude to God, you let me come into your presence. And I absolutely don't deserve it. I haven't earned this. I don't belong here. Throughout Scripture, we see people who come into God's presence just overwhelmed with fear. This idea you're on holy ground, and yet God welcomes us in. Do we come cynical? Do we come with our wish list, with this expectation that, God, you're here to serve me, right? So I'm coming this morning to worship you for what I can get from you. What's our posture for worship? These guys, however many they were, by the way, we don't know a number, 3 or 3 dozen, we don't know. They came and they threw themselves at his feet. They worshiped him. Whatever they actually were, Magi, representatives of kings, whatever it was, this is not the behavior of kings. It's not the behavior of that kind of position. Unless, of course, you believe you're worshiping someone far greater than you. And then even the greatest on earth should fall before the king. The reality is there is this vast chasm of holiness and righteousness between us and God. And on our best day, it's 1,000,000 miles away. And for us to pretend that we can come into God's presence casually, flippantly, means we don't understand who we are, and we don't understand who he is. The Magi come, they throw themselves at his feet. And it was customary in their culture, they gave a gift. And the level of gift corresponded to how you viewed, how you understood that person. And they brought 3 extremely valuable gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We know gold, right? That's enough in our culture. We get that one. Frankincense, not so much. It's a resin that comes from trees that has this sweet smelling incense to it, very valuable in their culture. Myrrh was very similar in that way. It came from a shrub, but it had this aromatic resin to it, used in perfumes and things like that. These are valuable gifts. They didn't walk up and be like, oh yeah, I forgot we should have brought something. What do I got here? A wadded up dollar. No. They came prepared to give their finest to the king. Do we come to give our finest? Do we worship by giving our best? Or just like what we feel obligated to? They came to worship in humility and in sacrifice, great sacrifice, from the day they left to their moment here in front of Jesus himself. And when they were done, in verse 12 it says, after being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they went back another route to their own country. How long did they stay? I don't know. Long enough to have a dream. And to have God protect Jesus through them by saying, go back a different way. And that's what they did. If you notice here in this part of chapter 2, there's almost nothing about Jesus, is there? Like, even though this is the birth story about Jesus, there's almost nothing about Jesus, other than the fact that he's a child, not an infant. We didn't talk about Jesus at all. So what's Matthew's point? What is it that he's trying to communicate to us in this? I think Matthew's point is contrast. Is the contrast between the people we see in this little passage. We see Herod, a wicked king, whose concern is only about himself. And the contrast between him and the righteous king of Jesus that we know came to be the sacrifice for the world. There's a contrast there. We see the Magi, the great distance that they traveled, the great sacrifice they made to come and worship. Versus the Israelite leaders, that we have no record of them even sending anybody down to Bethlehem to say, hey, we ought to check this out. They didn't care enough to even go investigate. And yet the Magi go 900 miles. We see the Magi and their genuine worship of focusing on the King, coming prepared to worship, to be in presence of the Messiah, as opposed to Herod that said, I want to worship, focused on me. That my worship will really be about me. And this contrast of being focused on him versus focused on ourselves. And of course, the Magi, and the fact that they even noticed the star, that they even saw it, that they connected the dots of whatever it was to what they knew from the scriptures, not even as Jewish people, as Gentiles, and then their response to what they observed and what they saw in scripture. And we juxtapose that against the Jewish leaders that knew far more than the Magi about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Yet they weren't aware enough to see it, and they didn't respond when they were told. And so the question, I think, is posed to us. Who are we? Are you Herod? And when you come to God, when you come to worship, your focus is really on yourself, not on Jesus? Are you like the Jewish leaders that you may know a lot about your faith, about the Bible, about Christianity? Maybe you've taken some classes, whatever. You know a lot, but you don't respond to it. You're just kind of an encyclopedia walking around, not someone following Jesus, not someone being obedient, noticing how God is working around you and inviting you into it. Or are you like the Magi? And you're just dumbfounded by the fact that God saved you and allows you to come and worship him. And so you want to honor him with your life, not just in these moments of worship on Sunday morning or whenever, but like you just have this general awe of like, wow, God, I am not worthy. Which best describes your worship, your posture coming to God? My prayer is today that we would be the Magi, that we would come with our hearts prepared for him, that we would humbly honor him with our lives. Would you pray with me, please? Father, I've heard it said that the greatest miracle you perform is humbling the human heart. Father, would you do that for us? That all of us who are prideful and arrogant, all of us who come to you flippantly or cynically with expectations, you'd humble us. That today through the Magi we would have our perspective corrected. We'd properly see who you are and who we are. And our response would be to worship you. And God, we do that in lots of ways. But really we do it in almost every way in our lives. It isn't just a singing thing. It's a how we live thing. And so, Father, make us people who worship you well, who honor you and glorify you and lift you high in our lives each and every day. Father, thank you for the Magi and the example they are to us. Thank you that you've preserved their story, even with the mysteries around it, so we can learn from them and grow from them. And we too can come and worship Jesus.